The silent trick that gives you power. How strong people win without speaking. What if every time you react, you're handing your power away? In a world that rewards the loudest voice, few realize that true strength lies in restraint, in silence, in the ability to observe without responding, to pause without panicking, to choose dignity over ego. Friedrich Nietzsche understood this long before psychology caught up. He saw that most of what we call debate is just ego in disguise. This video isn't about how to argue better. It's about how to stop needing to argue at all. It's about the hidden strength behind silence, the invisible power in letting go of control, and the freedom that comes when you no longer need to prove anything. If you've ever felt exhausted by conflict or empowered by your own silence, this message is yours. Let's begin. Friedrich Nietzsche, one of the most profound and paradoxical philosophers, once warned, the moment you react to others, they've already controlled you. Power does not come from winning arguments. It emerges from an inner calmness, from not allowing yourself to be pulled into the emotional whirlpool created by others. You might think arguments exist to uncover the truth, but the reality is, in most confrontations, what is being defended isn't truth, but the ego. The quicker you react, the more you reveal your weaknesses, the harder you try to prove your point, the more you let others see the insecurity silently eroding you from within. Immediate reactions are instinctive, but restraining your reactions, that is power. When you're attacked and choose not to respond, you're not weak, you're choosing to conserve your energy. You don't need immediate victory. You need to hold the upper hand. Silence doesn't take away your voice. Instead, it forces others to confront themselves. While they're waiting for your reaction, your silence becomes a mirror. They start hearing their own inner voices, and at that moment, you've taken control of the game without saying a word. True freedom begins when you no longer feel the need to defend your ego, when you realize no one can hurt you unless you allow it, when you refuse to react out of provocation, and instead, only act when you have a clear purpose. That is not weakness. It is inner strength. And sometimes, the only way to preserve your dignity is not to engage in battles that aren't worth sacrificing yourself for. Nietzsche, the one who awakens you from the dream of reason, in seemingly rational debates, what you believe to be right often doesn't come from truth, but from emotion, fear, and the need for validation. Friedrich Nietzsche wasn't merely a philosopher. He was an illusion breaker, a man who stood on the edge of the world and declared, "You do not live by reason. You live by instinct and pretend that it's truth." Nietzsche peered deeply into human nature and saw what most people dare not admit. We don't argue to understand, but to affirm ourselves. We don't seek the truth. We seek safety for our ego. Every attempt to explain the issue is just a cover for our insecurities. In Nietzsche's philosophy, there's a concept called will to power. Many misunderstand this as dominance and control over others. In truth, it's about mastering oneself, about overcoming reactionary instincts, overcoming the need for validation, overcoming the habit of arguing merely to assert intellectual superiority. Nietzsche didn't teach us how to speak correctly. He taught us when to remain silent. Silence isn't avoidance, it's awareness. The more internally mature a person becomes, the less they feel the need to speak. Not because they're afraid, but because they are no longer driven by the urge to win. While the world is busy rationalizing, Nietzsche strips away the masks of reason to expose the truth. Humans do not act out of logic, but from hidden motives in the subconscious. You shouldn't argue to win. You should observe to understand yourself. He makes us question not only others but ourselves. Why am I reacting this way? Why must I prove I'm right? Is it because I genuinely believe in it, or because I'm afraid to be seen as a failure? Nietzsche doesn't give you answers. He gives you a mirror to see yourself in the most naked form. And if you're brave enough to look a little longer, you'll realize that true power doesn't lie in the strength of your arguments, but in clarity that requires no justification. Arguments aren't about truth, but about wounded egos. Have you ever found yourself arguing just to win, even though deep down you're no longer certain you're right? Have you felt deeply hurt simply because someone disagreed with your opinion, even though it was a minor point? If so, you're not alone, because most arguments don't erupt over truth, but because the ego feels threatened. Nietzsche saw this clearer than anyone. We don't defend arguments, we defend our ego. The feeling of being denied, belittled, or losing in conversation doesn't come from logical reasons. It touches an unhealed wound inside us. The ego, always craving validation, correctness, and pride, immediately reacts when someone makes it feel less. Nietzsche didn't just analyze this philosophically, he revealed it with brutal honesty. He argued, "He who argues to win has already lost from the start." Because the moment you're drawn into a battle of pride, you've lost your self-control. You're no longer acting from understanding, but from defensive instinct. So what happens if you paused? If you don't need to win, if you don't need to be heard, don't need to be right. That's not weakness, that's a higher form of power. The power of someone no longer controlled by the ego. When you release the need for victory, you start hearing more, not only from your opponent, but from within yourself. And in that space, without arguments or comebacks, remains one essential truth you must face directly. You're hurt not by someone else's words, but by your own ego, which has yet to be healed. Lasting power doesn't come from words, but from inner calm. Most of us grow up believing that strength belongs to those who keep their promises through words and actions. That whoever makes the best argument wins, and whoever speaks louder is more right. But if you've ever witnessed someone who merely smiles calmly in the face of provocation, who pauses and thinks deeply before responding, you'll realize something. Real strength isn't found in speaking much, but in not needing to speak at all. Friedrich Nietzsche once implied, "The truly strong aren't the ones who fight back the best. They're the ones who refuse to be drawn into unnecessary battles." In anger, in pain, the human instinct is to react, to shout, to be heard, to argue, to prove rightness. But the more we react, the more we lose our grounding, the more we fight back, the weaker we become. Lasting power doesn't come from verbal victories. It comes from stillness. Stillness arises from an inner self that understands its own nature and no longer needs to prove anything. When you're no longer emotionally controlled by the words of others, when you remain calm amid an attack, you've entered a deeper state of power, the power of self-control. We often confuse eloquence with wisdom, but Nietzsche reminds us that words are merely tools, not essence. Sometimes the most powerful tool is not using any at all, because the person who needs no words to gain respect has already transcended the need to be respected. They do not seek validation from others because they have already validated themselves from within. In the deepest core of inner calm, we're no longer victims of our emotions. We become masters of our actions. That calmness doesn't weaken you against the world. It makes the world cautious around you. Timely silence is sharper than the cleverest retort. In a world where everyone is eager to speak, the person who knows how to remain silent becomes extraordinary. Extraordinary enough to make others cautious, because silence, when properly timed, is not mere endurance, but a sharp form of power. It doesn't need noise or proof, but can force the opponent to retreat by themselves. Nietzsche understood this clearly. For him, someone who doesn't retort is someone who has transcended the need to win. Such silence isn't weakness or resignation. On the contrary, it's the tactic of a strong individual, someone who has moved beyond anger, beyond the instinct to win at all costs, entering a state of absolute initiative. Try recalling some intense arguments in your life. How many times did you win verbally but feel mentally exhausted afterward? How many times did you respond cleverly and logically yet still ended up hurt? This happens because words, no matter how sharp, can be twisted, misunderstood, or countered. Silence, however, cannot. When you remain silent at the right moment, you create a void in that void. Your opponent is forced to listen to their own echoes. They cannot respond because you leave them nothing to react to. They cannot control you because you've given them no leverage. That emptiness makes them uneasy while you remain stable. Timely silence is a psychological blow. It makes your opponent question themselves. It forces them to reconsider their own words, feelings, and behaviors. You don't need to prove anything, because when others start questioning themselves, you've already won. A truly powerful person isn't one who always has clever responses, but one who knows when to speak and when to remain silent. They understand not every battle is worth fighting. nor every provocation worth responding to, because sometimes silence itself is the strongest answer in a noisy world. The person brave enough to remain silent is the one who truly impresses. Wisdom isn't found in quick reactions, but in the ability to master oneself and occasionally to maintain your power. You don't have to speak the truth, you just need to hold it within. Socrates, the master who made others, confused by their own arguments. In ancient Athens, a place where debate, argumentation, and reason were revered as life's art, Socrates didn't win by persuasive speeches. He didn't defeat his opponents with harsh words, nor did he ever try to assert that he was right. Instead, he did only one thing: ask questions. It is said Socrates confused his opponents not by attacking them, but by making them attack themselves. When a statesman claimed to understand justice, Socrates merely asked, "What is justice?" And with each question, definitions were peeled back, layers of reasoning collapsed on the speaker's own lips. No rebuttals were needed, no denials. He simply made people realize they didn't understand the very thing they were defending. This represents the quiet, yet profoundly deep power of inner awareness, a form of purposeful silence. Not silence to avoid conflict, but stepping back so others must approach truth by their own steps. Socrates understood that people aren't changed through coercion, but through realization. The fastest way to change someone is by revealing contradictions within their own thinking. Remarkably, Socrates didn't do this to win. He felt no need to prove himself, right? Instead, he famously claimed he was the only one who knows he knows nothing. This humility became his most dangerous weapon. It freed him from ego, from needing victory to feel valued. Modern psychology calls this reflective observation, a kind of intelligence that prevents one from falling into emotional traps. Socrates' method of questioning didn't feel aggressive, yet it triggered powerful internal collapse. Because when you recognize your own error, you cannot continue to defend it. In life, we often argue to win. Socrates didn't argue to win, he questioned to awaken. And this is a valuable lesson. You don't need to defeat others through logic sometimes. You just need to help them see they're going the wrong way, and they will turn around by themselves. Socrates embodied someone who didn't need to raise his voice, didn't need to defend positions, didn't even need to persuade others, because he trusted that truth, when properly evoked, would naturally resonate within others' minds. Steve Jobs, leading without force. Unlike Socrates with his philosophical questions, Steve Jobs embodied the modern leader who didn't rely on force. He never shouted to assert his authority, nor issued commands merely for compliance. Jobs simply made others see what he saw, and once they saw it, they required no coercion, they willingly followed. He allowed them to debate, express their viewpoints, even resist him rather than reacting. He listened. He continued painting a vision of the future, one where users would perceive technology as a natural extension of themselves. Eventually, those opposing him began to see their stance as outdated ultimately. These very individuals became the designers of the keyboard-less iPhone that transformed the world. Jobs never needed to argue, for he didn't seek validation. What he sought was transformation, a shift in how others perceived the world. He achieved this not by applying pressure, but through the quiet yet powerful persuasion of an exceptionally clear vision. This was his profound psychological strategy. When you lead others to believe an idea is their own, they defend it passionately. Steve Jobs didn't win through argument. He won by helping others feel the truth he already saw. In a world full of debate, Jobs exemplifies a crucial lesson. You don't have to argue well to lead others. You simply need clarity of mind, strength and conviction, and enough patience to plant the seeds of awareness. Musashi, defeating opponents within their own minds. Miyamoto Musashi, a legendary Japanese swordsman, was living proof of a fundamental truth. True victory doesn't occur on the battlefield, but in the opponent's mind beforehand. He was a master at defeating enemies not merely through skill, but through psychological strategy, chillingly precise and profound. Musashi engaged in over 60 life-or-death sword duels and never lost once. Yet his enduring admiration wasn't just due to swordsmanship, it was how he made his opponents defeat themselves. One of his most famous duels was against Sasaki Kojiro, a formidable swordsman famed for his lightning-fast swallow-cut technique. Musashi understood a simple truth. An angry opponent is a weakened opponent. One who loses control exits the battle mentally long before swords even clash. Nietzsche called this the ultimate control, controlling not only oneself, but also others' minds. Musashi wasn't an aggressive warrior, he was an observer, patient, watchful, striking only when his opponent's psychological state cracked. In today's world, this remains unchanged. The victor isn't the loudest, but the one who stays composed when others lose their calm. Musashi's message serves as a powerful reminder. When you remain composed amidst chaos, your opponents reveal weaknesses they themselves don't recognize. You don't need to fight, you merely wait for the right moment. Those truly strong know when to speak and when to step back. There's an intriguing paradox in modern society. The louder people try to assert themselves, the more attention is drawn to those who remain strategically silent. True power doesn't depend on how much you speak, but rather on knowing precisely when to speak and when to remain silent. In psychology, individuals with strong inner resilience master their responses to external stimuli. They don't allow emotions to guide their actions, don't speak merely in reaction, and aren't threatened by silence. It is precisely this deliberate choice, knowing when to communicate or withdraw, that creates a subtle yet significant form of power. Nietzsche described this as the hallmark of the Superman, the Übermensch, not someone who dominates, but someone who observes. They don't react instinctively, they act with conscious awareness. A well-timed word can turn a situation around completely, but a poorly timed statement can destroy trust you've built over a lifetime. In life, we often feel pressured to respond immediately, defend our views, or prevent others from overpowering us. Yet the truly powerful feel no need to prove anything. They don't need universal agreement because they are clear within themselves. They don't always have the answer, but when they do speak, others listen. Remember this: your presence holds value not because you're always there, but because you know when to step back and become rare. Silence isn't avoidance, it's a deliberate choice, a means of controlling the situation from within. The strongest person is the one who no longer needs to prove anything. On the journey of self-development, there's a milestone not everyone reaches: the moment you no longer feel the need to prove your worth to anyone. At that point, you don't just become free, you become unwaveringly stable. Why do we always strive to prove ourselves? Because deep down, we still doubt our own worth. We seek praise from others to soothe our fear of abandonment. We crave recognition to hide our sense of inadequacy. But Carl Jung once said, "You cannot awaken someone who is pretending to sleep." And many of us live exactly like that, in a dream called needing validation. Truly strong people don't have to win every argument. They don't have to shine in every room. They can remain silent yet still radiate charisma, because their confidence doesn't come from external agreement. It comes from deep internal reconciliation. Nietzsche called this strength self-sufficiency. When you no longer live as an actor in society's play, but become the director of your own life. When you're no longer driven by the need for praise, you start acting out of truth, righteousness, and your chosen path, not external validation. Genuinely strong individuals don't become angry when misunderstood, don't feel diminished when rejected, and don't tremble when judged. They don't need to retaliate, justify, or elevate themselves by belittling others. It is precisely that silence, that radiant strength. And when you reach that state, you realize a profound truth: there's nothing left to prove, because you're already yourself whole and complete. Debate isn't for winning, but for changing yourself and the world. Most of us enter arguments with a singular goal: to win. We want our words to be recognized as correct, our viewpoints respected, and our egos protected. But in Nietzsche's philosophy, and among those who genuinely understand inner strength, debate isn't a weapon to defeat others. It's a tool to elevate oneself to new levels of understanding. A wise person doesn't argue to prove a point, but to discover. They ask questions not to trap opponents, but to untangle their own inner contradictions. Because the wisest individual is always willing to be persuaded, if the truth emerges clearly. Nietzsche argued that we don't debate to find truth, but to preserve our ego. Consequently, most debates become endless confrontations. Everyone speaks, no one listens. Everyone wants to be right, no one seeks to understand. But if you shift your approach, entering discussions not to win, but to deeply observe human behavior, each debate becomes a classroom. You learn how others think, how fear governs actions, and how the past influences current emotions. Gradually, you begin to change quietly yet sustainably. You no longer need to win because you've achieved something greater, the evolution of your own thinking. And sometimes, your calm demeanor impacts others far more powerfully than eloquent arguments. Mature individuals don't need others to lose for them to feel victorious. They debate not to assert superiority, but to turn dialogue into a meeting place of truth, even if that truth forces both sides to change. Silence isn't avoidance. It's controlling the game from within. Silence is often misunderstood as weakness, speechlessness, or having nothing to say in response. But in the inner world of strong individuals, silence isn't surrender, it's a deliberate strategy. Not everyone dares remain silent, especially when emotions surge or the ego feels challenged. Nietzsche implied that real strength doesn't come from constant reactions, but from the ability to decide precisely when to speak and when to remain silent. The weak are controlled by emotions. The strong control their emotions to shape their responses. In social situations, those who talk the most aren't necessarily the ones in control. Instead, those who observe, listen, and maintain silence are truly controlling the atmosphere. Silence leaves others restless, guessing, revealing more than they realize. And when you finally speak at the right moment and place your words carry significantly greater weight. Choosing silence isn't avoiding conflict, it's preventing yourself from falling into unconscious reactions. Because the moment you allow someone to provoke anger, force responses, or draw you into unnecessary arguments, you've lost control. A cool head, one that doesn't speak hastily, always makes others cautious. A mind that isn't easily disturbed always gains respect. Someone who can remain silent amidst chaos truly controls the game. Silence means not letting yourself be carried away. It means conserving strength. It means not handing emotional control to anyone else. It is the soft yet strongest form of defense. And from there, from no words, no reactions, you open a new space. A place where inner strength recovers, where your core self remains intact, and you step away from small games to prepare for a greater journey. When you let go of the need to control, true healing begins. We grow up believing that if we control everything, emotions, relationships, outcomes, we won't get hurt. We learn to prepare for every scenario, analyze every risk, and build defensive barriers to shield ourselves from pain. But Nietzsche and Carl Jung, as well, warned that the need to control is exactly what wounds us the most. Because the world cannot be controlled, people cannot be programmed, life always unfolds in its own way, beyond prediction. The more you attempt control, the more anxiety you experience, the more you try to influence others, the more you become dependent on their responses. The more you expect everything to match your desires, the greater your suffering when things don't follow your plan. Control doesn't strengthen you. It makes you more vulnerable when life deviates from your expectations. True healing begins when you let go, not giving up, but accepting. It means knowing you cannot control others, but can master your reactions. You cannot change the past, but you can choose how to retell that story within your mind. When you abandon the need to be right, to be loved, to win, you start truly living. You're no longer a puppet pulled by expectations or fears. You become someone who can stand calmly in the storm. Nietzsche calls this the will to power, but not power to dominate the world. It's power to transcend yourself, power to choose silence over anger, to step back instead of trying to control, to forgive rather than hold grudges. At that point, you no longer need to prove anything. You don't need victory. You don't need others' understanding, because you finally understand yourself, and that's the greatest freedom. Healing doesn't arise from controlling the external world. It starts from a simple yet profound act, letting go. Within that quiet moment where struggle ceases, you find what you've sought your entire life: peace. The journey to inner strength isn't a loud path. It's quiet, patient, illuminated from within. And only when you relinquish the urge to control do you create space to awaken, grow, and love freely. External silence, the doorway to deep inner strength. There are silences that aren't merely the absence of sound, but internal states, moments when you cease reacting, cease struggling, cease needing to prove anything outwardly. Nietzsche understood silence isn't weakness, but a form of self-mastery, how the strongest individuals access their true inner strength. When you no longer hastily respond, no longer feel compelled to prove right or wrong, win or lose, you begin hearing far more significant voices, the voice of intuition, suppressed emotions, truths hidden behind the ego's facade. External silence becomes a doorway into the inner world, where you can touch the roots of fears, desires, and unspoken wounds. This isn't darkness leading you astray, but a territory helping you deeply understand yourself. In that silence, you no longer need to be heard to feel valuable. You require no external validation. You step away from life's spotlight into a quieter stage, illuminated from within. Instead of reacting, you observe. Instead of judging, you understand. Instead of seeking external power, you cultivate a new kind, power unshaken by anything external. Nietzsche didn't encourage avoiding life, rather, he urged deeper experiences by not being controlled by surface events. Those who know timely silence reach a higher level of consciousness, a place few dare enter. So, if you're learning to remain silent, not out of fear, but from deeper self, understanding that's a sign of maturity. When silence becomes not emptiness but strength, you discover profound inner power unaffected and undisturbed by anyone or anything. Then, each quiet step resonates with clarity, the clarity of someone who's mastered themselves.